and I'm delighted to welcome our third speaker of the day. Broderick Chow is a reader in theatre, performance and sport and Deputy Dean of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. His research concerns the intersections of sport, theatre and physical culture, which he explores historically through ethnography and practice research. He is co-editor of Performance and Professional Wrestling and the forthcoming sports plays. His forthcoming book, Dynamic Tensions, explores the origins of men's fitness practices in UK, US popular culture. Okay, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you to all of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities for the kind invitation today. I'm going to start screen sharing now. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking to you about the kind of bulk of my research in physical culture and sport forms, and I suppose the interesting intersection that I lie on between theater and performance and the physical culture and sports studies, as well as a intersection between the methods that follow those two different disciplinary fields. So I think whereas practice research is quite talked about, for 10, 15 years now, has been, talked about in theater and performance, within sports studies, we talk much more about arts-based research as a qualitative method. So I'm going to be speaking to you about the intersections and maybe some of the challenges and difficulties, but also the rewards of speaking across those two languages. So this project, it's really like the kind of main research that I do now, but it started, I suppose, earlier than 2016, but it started in earnest with a funded project called Dynamic Tensions, New Masculinities in the Performance of Fitness. This was a 2-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And in brief, this project was intended to study the history of physical culture and fitness from the lens of theater and performance studies, to apply performance methodologies to the study of contemporary physical culture, i.e. fitness practices, and then finally situate physical culture as a performed practice within cultural and social formations, especially with regards to gender formation and masculinities. I was proposing that this project would have discrete phases. Firstly, archival work, a period then of ethnography and field work across 3 different gyms, and then a period of artistic practice research where I would explore what had come from the first 2 phases and culminate in a live performance. In actuality, nothing like that happened. It was all much, much more entangled. Archival work fed into performance practice. Ethnography definitely fed into performance practice, and they all worked together in a way that was surprising and actually very rewarding. The boundaries between these phases and methodologies were actually very porous. So in the initial funding bid to the HRC, I suggested that this would be the first project to apply performance methodologies to the study of fitness and physical culture. And I had a naive vision of myself as this kind of artistic research pioneer working through theater performance in a landscape that, hadn't a fallow field that hadn't been plowed before. And I sort of entered that field and actually found myself in a forest. There was much more of an interesting exploration that was going on in qualitative research, using arts-based methods in ways that were much more aims and objectives-based, but was part of a language that I could speak to. So I'm going to speak to that in a little bit, but what I'd like to do first is so that we're all on the same page, I'm going to cover some of the materials that I was working with and the histories and practices that I was working with in terms of what physical culture is. Then I will have a brief methodological discussion of practice research versus arts-based research methodologies. And then finally, I'll talk about a specific case study. So the physical culture movement. What I mean by physical culture is a movement of practices, many different that really arose in the mid-19th century and grew grew in intensity towards the late 19th century and sort of faded out, or actually was much more absorbed and evolved into what we now know as fitness and exercise in the 20th century. I say this, I have this focus on the 19th century because in my archival work, what I really found was that it is a defined moment, that the 19th century is the origin of fitness and physical culture. A lot of people like to think that people have always exercised, it goes back to the ancient Greeks and so on, but actually no, the specific forms of intentional bodily self-transformation really came in the mid-19th century as a result of a number of different forces that were happening, one of which being the intensification of industrial capitalism, the division between labor and leisure. Another technology being the invention of photography a few decades later, and the final technology being theater and performance itself. So the performance of physical culture on stage was a key mode of its dissemination. So what kinds of practices made up physical culture? Well, weightlifting was one, and by that I mean the form of the sport of weightlifting, not just the practice of lifting some weights, but actually lifting increasingly heavy weights. Strongman was another form, as you can see here, the French-Canadian strongman Louis Cyr, very early physical culturist. Bodybuilding or intentional self-transformation. Gymnastics, or in German, Turnverein. Wrestling, hand balancing, boxing, Indian club swing, really unfamiliar form of fitness, which very few people see anymore, but that's kind of like heavy clubs that look like bowling pins that you could do interesting formations with, and strongman feats. And so physical culture was performed on stage, and the programs were then sold through mail order programs and magazines. So the initial phase of physical culture is they really use the stage as a form of advertising and lecture. You can see here some of the examples of the archival materials I work with. These are some photos of strongmen and hand balancers. What's interesting, I show this to you because this is an example of the types of archives that you're working with when you look at the origins of exercise. This is from the scrapbook of Otley Coulter, a circus strongman. It's available at the H.J. Luther Stark Center for Physical Culture and Sports at the University of Texas at Austin, where I did most of my archival work. He was both a strongman and an aficionado of physical culture. But you see here, nothing is dated. There's very little citations of anything. So we're already looking at a kind of problematic and theatrical archive. It's very difficult to tell how far these photos have been doctored. There is evidence of quite a lot of early photo doctoring in order to create these images. So already we're seeing this kind of connection to some of the key concepts of theatricality, which also brings us into the realm of anti-theatricality, which is a kind of philosophical form of thinking that relates all the way back to Plato, the kind of arguments against representation and theatricality from the point of view of it being false or a trick or illusory. You can see that here. This is an example of the strongman feats of the Welsh Hercules Burt Wickham. He famously stopped a car on stage. Really what happened was that the car just put itself in neutral, and then it spun its wheels on the stage. So there's already quite a lot of evidence or writing around the tricks that strongmen used to perform their modes, which is not to say that they didn't do anything, that none of this was real, but actually it shows how there is already a form of exaggeration or emphasis underlining all physical culture work. Eugene Sandow was an early bodybuilder, and I'll talk about bodybuilding a little bit later as part of my case study. You can see here that some of the performances might have been So obviously this isn't performance documentation, but it is of a sort. I mean, this is one of the earliest films shot by Thomas Edison, and it really is a kind of recreation of some of the posing routines that Eugene Sandow would have performed on stage in London at theaters and music halls like the Alhambra. Professional wrestling is also a very strong part of physical culture, and it's actually one of my earliest projects. So before I engaged in this long considered history of physical culture, I actually did some ethnography and practice research to do with pro wrestling. This is from one of the training sessions in the school where I did the field work. And then with my collaborator, Tom Wells, we translated these wrestling forms into dance theater. This is us in the studio, and then into the performance work songs, 2012 to 2014, which use those forms to explore how labor became visible in on the stage. Weightlifting and bodybuilding are very strong forms of physical culture, really well-known forms of physical culture. This is Tommy Kono, who is a champion weightlifter and 5-time Mr. Universe. And back in the early 20th century, weightlifting and bodybuilding were very much together, and there was a separation in the 1950s between the weightlifting as a legitimate and objective sport and bodybuilding as an aesthetic sport. Another area that I've looked at is the original Muscle Beach, where we see a number of different forms of gymnastics and hand balancing were invented, leading to both a kind of aesthetic of the body, as well as forms that are practiced, for example, in cheerleading. And at the heart of this, I would consider myself part of the physical cultures, or at least very interested practically in living my life in terms of physical culture. So I'm a weightlifter myself, so I'm interested in the objective sport of weightlifting, but also in the aesthetics and self-transformation too. I have another part of the project where I look at minoritarian histories of race and physical culture, and specifically the history of Tommy Kono, and I write about that in relation to my own family history, being an East and Southeast Asian person and a child of immigrants from 2 different places. So I'm going to move on now to methodologies and thinking through the differences between practice research and arts-based research. So we are here because we're discussing practice research. Rachel Hahn, who some of you may have read on this topic, argues that the first wave of discussions about PAR was devoted for justification, just making the case for practice. And now I think institutionally we know that practice matters. There's a large number of performance research submissions to REF, PhDs, and so on. So now the second wave of practice research should focus on critical peer review and accessibility. But my contribution to this conversation is to draw in discourses from the qualitative social sciences, where arts practice has been an accepted, if siloed, method. I think that we ignore at our peril some of the other areas where this is already going on, but maybe has different aims. So Patricia Levy defines arts-based research as a set of methodological tools used by qualitative researchers across all the disciplines during all phases of social research, including data collection, analysis, interpretation, and representation. These emerging tools adapt the tenets of the creative arts in order to address social research questions in holistic and engaged ways in which theory and practice are intertwined. So arts-based research uses arts methods in terms of data collection, interpretation, learning something about social formations. We see a number of different labels for it, just as we do for practice research. So ABR, arts-based educational research, artography, which stands for artist, researcher, teacher, arts-based action research, applied and therapeutic arts practices. There's a number of different methods: painting, poetry, music, drama, theater, performance, dance, creative writing. And I'll add to this performance ethnography, such as Norman K. Denzin's work on ethnodramas and the ways of representing ethnography and fieldwork. So I'm going to talk about how this worked with one of my case studies on this project, because there were several. And this is going to be focusing on bodybuilding and performance itself. So bodybuilding, as I said, separated in the 1950s from weightlifting and became a kind of aesthetic practice. So we might read it as a liminal form of practice between performance and sport. And typically in the social sciences, it's read as in pathologizing terms, i.e. bodybuilding represents a kind of negative inscription of the body. Negative social forces are inscribing the body towards forms of, for example, hegemonic or toxic masculinity. It's a very gendered mode of writing about bodybuilding. So with women bodybuilding, there's a much, in the social sciences, there's a much more celebration of the subversive gendered aspects of the practice. But I was interested in looking at bodybuilding as a base of embodied knowledge that goes all the way back to the 19th century. So what are the forms, the gestures, the ways of doing and living that exist in this practice? How do bodybuilders themselves use this practice to make sense of the world? And I sort of count myself in this, even though I'm not, I don't consider myself a bodybuilder in the kind of the professional mode, but I practice it in some forms, and I think use it as a way of focusing and clarifying and thinking about the world. So we might look at this performance by Bob Paris, who is, Bob Paris is an openly gay bodybuilder. He's actually, I think, the first openly gay athlete in any sport. And so this is a posing routine at the 1988 Mr. Olympia contest. It's really interesting that this, he was like 10th in the competition, but this is a really classic piece of choreography that has really stood the test of time. So I think what I wanted to argue about this is that in the gestures themselves, in the forms of this choreography, there is already contained a kind of knowledge, a knowledge of the practice itself, a kind of embodied and technical knowledge, a techne, a skill that is itself a way of understanding the material world. And so I was interested then in exploring that with another collaborator. So I reached out to my friend Peter Moore, who is a bodybuilder, actor, and what I would call, for the purposes of this this work, an expert. And I take that word from the theater company Rimini Protocol, who use non-professional actors within their works, who are experts in their particular selves. So I just reached out to Peter to discuss a potential collaboration as part of this project. And we had many discussions initially, which were really trying to elucidate his take on what bodybuilding was to him as a practice. And so in the conversations, he began to elevate the intentionality and conscious performance of bodybuilding posing. So he talked about a scene in Pumping Iron where Arnold Schwarzenegger is posing for the prisoners, and he said every time he hits a pose they cheer. That's what it used to be like. Posing is supposed to be directed at other people, for other people, like it was a treat. But some of these guys today, it's the opposite, not about giving something to their audience. It's look at me, look at me, look at what I've accomplished, end quote. So in his intentionality, I thought there was something quite interesting here, that the outward directness of the performance itself was about communicating something that was inside. He then went on to talk about some of the actor training that he had done, and he made a connection between something called the mind-muscle connection, which is really kind of key in bodybuilding. It's like the form of focus that leads the exercise that you are doing. And he made a connection between that and Michael Chekhov's idea of psychological gesture, which in short is just a physical gesture that expresses a psychological or inner state of the character. So this became a kind of key mode in the way that we began playing together in the rehearsal studio. Gestures, I think, are key to my work because for me, they're a way of communicating. And I draw Carrie Nolan's definition, a kind of dual definition of gesture here. They are both a type of inscription, a parsing of the body into signifying or operational units, i.e. a kind of language of words. They can be thereby seen to reveal the submission of a shared human anatomy to a set of bodily practices specific to one culture. So, in short, the gestures that we use form a physical language that also might, for example, show the body's subjectification to a certain ideology, i.e. a kind of hegemonic or toxic masculinity. But at the same time, Nolan says, gestures provide kinesthetic sensations that remain in excess of what the gestures themselves might signify or accomplish within that culture. So in feeling something, in feeling the kinesthetic experience of that gesture, there is also the transformation of that gesture and the possibility of change. So she says in relation to Judith Butler, what if in performing a curtsy, one felt not just feminine, but also sore? So the psychological gesture and gestures as a whole inform the exploratory rehearsal process of the performance act. We began just by doing a kind of sharing of our practices. Peter taught myself and my assistant director, Jonathan, how to pose. And then we developed a technique that would eventually form the backbone of this act. So Peter would hold a pose, choose a pose, hold it, and then slowly begin to speak, reflecting on his life narrative. And this narrative went straight to story, but it was less about a presentation then of the objective narrative, getting at one single story, but rather thinking through narrative through the body. So the narrative itself is very key to physical culture. So we often hear about what I like to call the bodybuilder's journey, which is the idea of the way in which a narrative is communicated of a weak individual who is then transformed by physical culture into a strong man. Now, this bodybuilder's journey, I think, is actually refracted and reframed through actually seeing it in the body of another person and watching that bodily transformation, as opposed to the way in which this media is usually consumed, which is either through a screen or through print media. So it explores the body in its transformability to challenge or at least show the mutability of the paradigm of inscription, going back to that dialectic of the gesture that Carrie Nolan talked about. So I'll show a little bit of this sequence in the final performance. And this is to underscore how the posing was elevated into something else through the use of theatrical techniques. Okay, so I think the key to this is the way in which the theatrical gesture here is actually about the disarticulation of all of these elements that often in the performance of bodybuilding seems fairly integrated. And in doing so, the intention was to think through the intentionality of the gestures themselves and the way in which the aesthetic choice drives bodybuilding as a practice. So what are the key findings? Well, I'd like to say that this is like a really bad piece of social science research, but actually a fairly interesting piece of artistic practice research. This is a sample size of one person. This is one person's individual life history that I'm talking about and working through here. But actually what it does is it opens onto bodybuilding as a technique and practice. What it taught me was actually much more about bodybuilding itself. What I learned was the way in which bodybuilding foregrounds the conscious intentional gesture, which signals a way of thinking through intentionality in everyday life and theatricality in everyday life. Jody Enders, the theater scholar, explores a vast range of legal cases in her book, Murder by Accident, to conclude that actually there is, just like there is no murder by accident, there is no theater without intention. And I think this is the important part of thinking through the way in which gendered performance is not just performative, but it's explicitly theatrical. When one trains biceps, one must also think, I am working on biceps not as mantra, but as embodied action. One must see the shape of the muscle, how it interacts with other muscles in body. One must express biceps. And in this, I am reminded of the Japanese way of T, or chado, which is comprised of a series of codified rigid gestures called tamae. But this expressive practice of chado is not one of improvisational free movement, but a transformation of the everyday into self-conscious, mindful, and intentional gesture. In the same way, the face pull, the rope curl, bicep curl, bench press, all of these gestures of pushing and pulling become transformed into artistic ones that don't divorce them from the central ideologies that underpin or inscribe bodybuilding, but actually open onto a new way of understanding it. So I'll end there and I'll stop sharing. And any questions, I look forward to the conversation.